may all be asking, what about the energy needed to fuel all this growth? Well, that's precisely the topic of our next segment here. I'll be asking our guests to join us in a very short moment, but first, let's take a quick trip through the complex landscape of drivers and obstacles to decarbonization in this short film. Let's take a look. Sustainable energy, clearly a critical topic, so it's great to see meaningful progress, but obviously still a long way to go. To address the road ahead, we bring you a roundtable led by the Deputy CEO of Amundi, Head of the Institutional and Corporate Clients Division and ESG, Jean-Jacques Barbéris, and joining him are Greg Jackson, founder and CEO of Octopus Energy, Helena Viñes Fiestas, Spanish Financial Markets Authority Commissioner and Chair of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance, also joining the Head of Sustainability at the Singapore-based global investment firm GIC, Emily Chu. Please welcome them all to the stage. Thank you.
So hello everyone. So this year we're celebrating the 15th anniversary of the Amundi World Investment Forum, but we're also celebrating a little in advance the 10th year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And to introduce that session, I would like to share a few figures. The first one is that over the last 18 months, the emissions, the absolute emissions in China have dropped by 1.6%, whereas at the same time, the additional demand for power in China has increased from 2.5%. Meaning that there is a world where Chinese peak emission will be before 2030. Second thing, and I think Fatih Birol tomorrow will share that with us tomorrow, last year the investment into renewable energies have been twice more than the investment into fossil fuels. So it means that the transition had started, but there still it's a complex environment to navigate into that. So today, to address that question and to explore navigation of this world, the great thing is that we have an investor, a regulator, and someone that is manufacturing the transition for real. And this is how we're going to address, I would say, the session. So I would like first, Helena, to start with you. I think we're in Europe, we're in Paris. It's been a decade now that Europe has, I would say, implemented a set of regulations to support the transition. This being said, we see massive investments in renewable in China, also in the US. How the EU can benefit from this decade of being the early bird to support the transition going forward?
Thank you. Throughout the day, the course of today, we've been hearing about the geopolitical current disruptions, whether we're talking about the war in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East. The US is doubling down on fossil fuels expansion, not only on renewables, and China, we've seen that it's wrapping up a state-backed industrial competition. And all those dynamics, the only message to Europe is that it needs to intensify, it needs to accelerate, the transition to secure, clean energy. And yet, We are experimenting, and we are seeing pressures mounting internally and externally to actually, slow down and to water down our climate goals and our climate policies. Goals that needs to be set. They are anchored into law. They are embedded into industrial and investment frameworks. So what is really important for everyone to understand is that A, the green transition is a unique chance for Europe to secure energy independence, to renew industrial renewable and long-term competitiveness. And secondly, is that in this turbulent world, Europe's rule of law, policy predictability and stability is actually a really powerful asset. And what does it mean, asset? And what does that mean? Well, two things. First of all, that this movement that we see now coming from the European authorities on simplifying regulation is much welcome, but it cannot be an euphemism for deregulation. Yeah? It needs to be based on evidence, and it cannot create instability or uncertainty to neither companies nor investors. And secondly, we need to learn to move better and faster. We need to focus on implementation. We need to really enhance finance for, access to finance, particularly for SMEs. And finally, we need to really scale up green industrial policy in strategic sectors such as storage.
Greg, I think you said once that electricity is the energy of the 21st century, and basically you're building up, I would say, a global manufacturer of the transition. So how can you be even more successful? How can we have more Octopus energy, I would say, at European level in the context that Helena just described?
I think fundamentally, is this working? No. There we go. I think fundamentally, electricity from renewables is not a direct replacement for fossil fuels. Of course, many people from the traditional energy industry are right to worry about the fact it's not always windy, it's not always sunny. But what they forget is at the times it is windy and times when it is sunny, we have the cheapest power we've ever had in absolute abundance, and it's getting cheaper every year, and it causes no damage to our climate. It's naturally more secure, more resilient, because it's distributed. If we capitalize on these characteristics, then we think about things like an electric car. An electric car doesn't care whether you fill the battery at 5 p.m. or 7 p.m. or at midnight or at 2 a.m. You can fill that battery at the cheapest possible times. Now, we do this at huge scale in our company. We have 300,000 customers with electric cars in the UK, 1.9 gigawatts of power, the same as 2 nuclear reactors. And electric cars are only 5% of UK cars. But because we charge those cars intelligently, their electricity is 3 times cheaper than the grid, 6 times cheaper than petrol. In fact, if people have got a battery that goes both ways, we give them 20,000 kilometers of free driving every year. So look, I use this as an example because I want to say that too often our citizens are being told that the energy transition is a compromise, that it's going to cost more. But if we innovate to make the most of these new fuel sources, we can make the entire system cheaper for everyone. And you talked earlier about, China. Look, what China has got right is it isn't just looking at the source of electricity. For example, 60% of all the renewables built in the world last year were built in China. But it's been looking at consumption. So electricity has gone from 10% of Chinese energy 20 years ago to 33% now. Europe, the US, the UK has been stuck at 20% the whole time. So increasingly, what's happening in China is they're going straight from very cheap electricity, increasingly from renewables, into the electrification of transport and of heating and of industry. And the big opportunity and the big risk for Europe is that we need to do the same. There was an article in the Financial Times 2 weeks ago that described China as the world's first electro-state. And we should all be thinking very hard about what happens when you have an entire economy powered by electricity that's 3 times cheaper than ours, with no carbon, powering cars that are better and cheaper than ours, an industry that has already overtaken ours and will be getting cheaper every year. So I think the real opportunity here is capitalize on this technology. Don't try to extend the life of the increasingly redundant technologies of the past.
Emily, on your side, from an investor perspective, first it's an invitation to invest into some companies for sure, but how do you navigate into that? What are the lenses you put to look at that and how to allocate your capital vis-à-vis the transition?
Thanks for the question. There's three key drivers or lenses that we're focused on right now at GIC in the transition, and I'd say more broadly, the climate investing space. So I'll address the first two, which directly pertain to transition, and the third is almost a complementary theme that we're more recently looking at, complementary to the transition. So the first is that the policy signals that we're seeing do not match up with the aggregate of the negative headlines around green and climate transition investing. We conduct ongoing climate policy monitoring, looking at both medium and immediate impacts in key markets, and our analysis suggests that it's not at all a one-way pullback from climate and green energy transition in the light of current global affairs. And my fellow speakers have already alluded to this, but what we're seeing in the EU under the competitiveness compass, which is paving the way for more industrial and energy policies to address affordability, demand for green products, and mobilizing capital to support clean tech manufacturing has been noted internally. We're also looking at Australia, China, and the UK as key geographies that are continuing to accelerate their policy frameworks in support of green and climate investing. And so that's a really key and important lens that we use. Related to that is the economic viability of the actual technologies. And Greg, you mentioned this, it's cheaper. It's really important to look at the fundamentals of the technologies. So we looked at this a couple of years ago. We did a whole piece of research looking at where in the decarbonization value chain are the investable opportunities. And what our research was focused on revenue and value rather than the size of the financing gaps needed. So bringing that investor lens, we're focused on the future enterprise value and when we place capital. And we found that climate solutions supply chain could add 5 to 11 trillion in value by 2030. That's as of a couple of years ago. We're updating that research in the coming year. But the point was that it created conviction internally that it's a really significant investable opportunity. The most promising opportunities we found at that time were in the more mature solutions like renewable energy and sustainable vehicles. And that's really borne out in the last year where we've seen mature technologies seeing a 14.7% uptick in investment based on 2024 Bloomberg data, whereas more emergent or nascent technologies saw a decline in investment. So not all decarbonization and transition investing is the same. You really need to look at that levelized cost of energy, which technologies are in the money today. And then I mentioned a third lens or driver that we're looking at right now, which is that additive to transition investing is what's coming online is adaptation and resilience investing. I mentioned this in the context of a transition discussion because actually some of the technologies and solutions that address the most important physical impacts of climate change are also transition plays. They're not just one or the other. But the research we've done more recently, trying to distill a more pure adaptation investment signal, found that adaptation solutions that we can identify today are already around 1 trillion in annual revenues from the most interesting and immediate solutions, and it could grow to about US $4 trillion by 2050, with about 2 trillion of that growth incremental because of projected physical impacts of climate change. And these are things like weather intelligence systems, wind-resistant building components, and flood-resistant construction materials. So what we're seeing is adaptation and resilience investing coming online as a complementary and additive theme to transition investing.
What I think interesting as well is that we're progressively switching to the policy making of the question of the transition. And maybe, Greg, coming back to you, I think you often say that the transition in developed economies is on the way, but still not probably at the right speed, because markets are being designed to meet the demands of the energy of the past. Can you elaborate a little bit, and what do you need from a policy making perspective to have the right market incentives to continue to develop at the speed you mentioned in the past 10 years?
Yeah, I think, first of all, we talked about the importance of the electro-state, the electro-future, which means that we need to recognize in most Western advanced economies, electricity exclusively goes into a grid and comes out of a grid. There's very little ability to have proprietary routes to market for electricity at scale. Now that means that the entirety of our evolution into this electro-future is driven by grid regulation. And grid regulation was designed in most countries at a time when all of our electricity came from fossil fuel power stations, a bit of nuclear, maybe some hydro. So typically, you could turn on a power station, you get a rectangle of power, and you turn it off when you don't need it. And the grid operator would centrally stack up as much generation as necessary to meet demand. In a world where renewables are moving from being an add-on to that system to becoming the system, we need to flip it on its head. Because in a renewable world, you basically wake up in the morning, you look at the weather forecast, and you know that you're going to have a lot of electricity now, and then not very much, then a lot. And the more you can shift your demand to the times that the electricity will be generated, the dramatically cheaper and more effective your investment in renewables is, and the more you're able to be a competitive economy. Now, in the old days, you couldn't do that, because our electricity was used for turning on lights, which you need them when you need them. But today, our biggest, heaviest users, many industrial processors, many heating processors, charging electric vehicle batteries, are all very, very shiftable. And with modern technology, we can monitor usage through smart metering and every equivalent very, very finely. So we can provide huge economic incentives to move power around. We also have increasingly grid-level storage. Grid-scale batteries have fallen in cost 90% in the last decade. They've gone from being unfeasible to increasingly very, very efficient. And the costs keep coming down. Now, with a grid battery, or indeed any other storage, you've got to be choosing when to charge it, when to discharge it, when to hold it. All of this needs vast amounts of data. So what we need to do is move our grids from being run like a minicab, like a taxi office with guys on the phone, to being run like Uber, with huge amounts of data matching supply and demand at each location. And that requires price signals, because it doesn't matter how much data you've got, you need to optimize against the economics. And I'll just give you one data point to blow your mind. Octopus in the UK alone processes 348,000 pieces of data every second. That's 30 times more than Visa globally for payments. That's what we need to be doing if we're going to run an efficient energy system based on renewables. But the technology is there to do it. The markets are not.
Great. I will not enter into the debate between Uber and taxes in France, but that's another story. Helena, to design properly, we need also, I'd say, a financial regulatory agenda that supports the investment. We have plenty of taxonomies all around. Can you tell us a little more, how do you envisage, I would say, the next stage of the financial regulation to support more investment in the transition, and how to use the world of interoperability? We can envisage more and more these regulations to set the stage properly together.
Yes. Let me start by saying how successful, to a certain extent, has been the sustainable finance framework in Europe. Yeah? Thanks to partially sustainable finance framework and to the leadership and efforts of financial institutions such as yours, today Europe is, by and large, and without any doubt, the sustainable finance leader. 62% of its market is ESG. We're the leaders in the green bond market. 800 billion, invested in climate mitigation, guided by the taxonomy. Does it mean that it's perfect? No. But what it means is that it needs to be reviewed, and today what we know is what it works and what it doesn't work. Yeah? So efforts like the ones that are being doing on simplifying the taxonomy are much, much welcome. efforts that they're doing, that we see on the table, to cut the scope of application, to really reduce the number of companies that need to be reporting on sustainability, is really bad news for the competitiveness of the sustainable finance market in Europe. Yeah. Now, when it comes to internationally, I would say that Europe has been looking too much inwards, and we haven't been actively collaborating externally and actually, maximizing and benefiting from our leadership. And one of the areas, and great example, you mentioned taxonomies. The EU taxonomy has inspired 58 taxonomies. Now, we all know that in order for financial markets to pick it up, we need interoperability, we need taxonomies that are operable in different markets. The problem is that a taxonomy also needs to reflect the financial, economic, and environmental reality of a country. But the soil problems in Europe are totally different than in Brazil. But we have one global problem, environmental problem, climate. And at the same time, we know that the growth of investments have been, reduced or limited to 5 key economic activities. More than 75% of the proceeds of green bonds ever issue have been invested in 5 economic activities, from real estate, renovation, clean transport, renewables, and so forth. If only, Europe could lead the development of technical criteria for those 5 activities throughout, and then be embedded in those 58 taxonomies, jurisdictions that represent 65% of the global GDP, we would have done a massive step forward for financing the transition.
Thanks, but to use a British understatement, at the moment we see there is a little bit, I would say, of trouble in the policy making regarding the transition. So, Emily, last question for you. How do you adapt to that policing environment that is not that stable at the moment?
Well, I mean, the taxonomies are very important, and we do use them to help with monitoring, tracking, developing our own proprietary frameworks. It's the pricing signals that really moves the capital. And that's where we've seen very troubling policy uncertainty. Despite all of that, we have the long-term time horizon that enables us to invest through the cycle. So we're looking for attractive investments with attractive economic fundamentals, aided by structural tailwinds. Those tailwinds may or may not be supported by policy. So if you have the structural tailwind that isn't supported by policy, we may still place capital where the valuation is attractive. And ideally, you would have a policy framework that would further accelerate those tailwinds. So essentially, we're looking for investments that are ultimately policy resistant, still attractive regardless of what the policy is. Some of the things that we've talked about on this panel is the build out of the grid, the demand for the incredible kind of expansion of energy that's needed on the grid, that's going to require more management of the grid, more expansion of the grid, more storage options on the grid, and more energy efficiency. All of these kind of activities that are happening in the expansion of our energy needs are ultimately going to be, for a very long-term investor, net beneficial for the greening of the energy system, and the build-out of renewables will happen. So we're seeing it's an and mentality right now, and those regions and those companies that are doing it in a way which is more climate-friendly, more clean tech-oriented, we see as being better placed over the long term.
Well, thank you very much. I think the conclusion we can take out of this roundtable is that the transition has started, whatever it takes, to use the words of a number of people. And let's maybe reconvene in 10 years for the 20 years anniversary of the Paris Agreement. Thank you really much. And please, a round of applause for our panelists.
Fantastic panel. Many thanks. What a lively and engaging discussion indeed. Let's look at matters from an investment viewpoint now with our experts from Amundi.